represent CMC, which is a Dublin-based company. We are the marketing arm of Cerrejón. Most of you will be aware, I guess, that Colombia has gradually moved up in the league table of thermal coal exporters. Colombia now does roughly 85 million tons a year. Cerrejón and Drummond are roughly the same size, doing 32, 33 million tons a year. Nearly all obviously to the Atlantic. We, like the third biggest supplier, which is Prodeco, owned by Glencore, all of those companies made quite significant investments in infrastructure about 4 years ago with additional port capacity and additional infrastructure. Those investments were made at much the same time as everybody else was investing in thermal coal production facilities, and we all know what has happened to the market in recent years. But this is a fairly robust production country. The CV is roughly between about 5,700 and 6,000 kcal NAR. All of the major ports are on the Caribbean coast of Colombia, so the natural export markets are the US, the Mediterranean, and Europe. There is a limited amount of Colombian coal that goes through the Panama Canal east, and there is a certain amount of Colombian coal that goes to Asia via either one cape or the other, and there have been some interesting movements there. So Cerrejón, 32 million tons, 33 million tons a year, roughly, of thermal coal mined in Colombia and marketed from Ireland.
My name is Andrey Tarasko. I represent here the biggest exporter of anthracite in the world. It's company Siberian Anthracite, and at the same time we're the biggest producer of anthracite in Russia. We're quite established all around the world. Majority of our sales is going to Asian markets. Selling the anthracite and being the biggest exporters of anthracite, I mean, this material could be used in different applications, mainly to metallurgical industry, but that's why it's interesting to see the physical reaction of growth, of economic growth all around the world. So we can see it through demand to anthracite. Totally, we are doing around 10 million tons of productions, and around 95% of this material is exporting. Briefly, it's like this.
Thanks. So obviously, coal's had quite a good year this year. I mean, I joined Coaltrans at the end of 2015, so it's quite nice. This is probably the first conference that I've held where we've been able to say that. We've heard a lot this morning, particularly from Rodrigo, about how the primary drivers of the price has been a supply shock rather than a demand shock. Do you recognize that? I mean, what do you see as do you think the fundamentals driving the price are strong at the moment?
Definitely. I mean, previous speaker gave a good example and good graphs how price is connected and which factors are influencing the demand of a coal. We see what world economy is back on track of growth all around the world, both in developed and emerging economies. And as I told before, if you would see, he showed the clear connections between the economic activity and the demand for the energy sources like coal. We, as anthracite producers, see other side of the story because we are not. This material is not going to thermal actually as an energy source. Mainly, it's going to for steel productions or for chemical productions. So we see what. Physically, we see additional demand and huge support, and you would look at World Steel report, for example, for this year, you would see what there is a additional steel demand. You see additional steel capacity, which is a consequence of growth of economy, obviously.
I think we have all become experts at explaining what has happened, and still the slight difficulty is then working out what is going to happen. I think we can all agree that the lower prices of coal, which we saw up until about the middle of last year, represented, as has been said a number of times, more oversupply than under demand. A large number of investments were made across the world in an expectation of continued growth in coal demand. We all remember, and I mentioned this about an hour ago, the expectation that China represented a paradigm shift, and in the end that turned out not to be the case. And the inflated expectations, certainly of some, of what we were likely to see from India and other countries in Asia, they may be happening, but they're happening a lot more slowly and uncertainly than was expected. And therefore we were all aware that we were in a period of oversupply, and that was in the end going to take its toll on prices, which it did. That, as we know, started to come to an end roughly 18 months ago. And I think there have been two interesting developments since then. The peak of the frenzy, and the journalists always get frenzied, the peak of the frenzy was probably late last year, when prices pretty much got up to $100 Newcastle, with South Africa and Colombia following a little way behind. But it seemed to me that there were a number of things that were starting to come together at that time. And one of them probably was that buyers had lured themselves into an expectation that almost any coal that they wanted at any time would be readily available, and that anybody who needed even just 1 or 2 capes for delivery in a month or two's time, that they would be able to let that be known to the market, and then they would be flooded with offers. And towards the end of last year, it suddenly became apparent that that wasn't the case. And we had the position in November and December last year where we were getting calls from a buyer in Denmark, a buyer in Germany, a buyer in Chile, and each only wanted a small additional volume. But added together, that represented a volume which simply wasn't there. Actually not a million miles different from the picture of this year that Rodrigo was describing this morning. But that sort of was overcome by about the early part of this year. The prices started to drift back again. And then we have had, over the course of the last few months, a number of things coming together. I dislike the expression perfect storm, and it isn't that. But certainly when you add up to the fact that there were issues in Korea, there were issues in France, there have been weather issues both in Australia and Colombia, there's been a small amount of industrial action in different places, there's been nothing absolutely enormous, but all of these things together have come either to restrict supply or to push up demand. And then when you add on to that suddenly the policies of the Chinese government and then the way things play out in China mean that then you have 25 million tons extra demand from China, which no one was expecting, then that all pushes in one direction. And so, as we were saying a little bit earlier, it is not at all clear where that goes. In our view, it is not certain that there is additional supply readily available. I buy into what Rodrigo said, that there is certainly some capacity available from the US, but that is mainly high sulfur. It has a market in some countries, but not all. Not everybody wants to or is able to take that sort of material, and therefore it is quite possible that a certain amount of tightness remains. But there is a lot still to play out on both supply and demand. In the meantime, yeah, we're quite enjoying it, really.
You've covered my second question a little bit there, which was primarily about the supply reaction as, like you say, being a bit more muted than perhaps we would have expected, given the price increases we've seen over the past 18 months. Are you at all concerned about the market returning to oversupply, or if not, what are the primary restrictions on increased output, particularly from, I suppose, Colombia and Indonesia, but also Russia as well?
I mean, our company is a good example to this restriction and limitation which we have. For this year, we doubled our production and export. But technically, we can produce a little bit more, but we cannot supply our clients, and we see a big demand, as Howard told before. Actually, market turned to buyer market for last period of time, for I guess for 6, 8, 9 months, as we see it physically. But Russia increasing export like 5% previous year, and I guess what will increase 10% this year. But still, there are a lot of issues. In each country has its own issues, actually, but Russia has a huge deficit of ports still. We have huge problems with railway transportation. Now there is a deficit of car wagons for now. So we just have a small charts with the top managers of main producers and exporters of Russia, and we've got all of us competing to the same infrastructure. We're competing to the same at the same ports. We're sharing the same number of wagons. So it's really supply become an issue to our clients. All of us has a demand. All of us has a contract. So the situation is quite tough for now.
And for me, and adding to that, it is down to a question of, will the investment be made? All of us are aware of the commodity cycles in all sorts of commodities going back decades, where prices go up, then there is a hesitation, then everybody piles in, then the investments are made, then there is a period of good times, and then it all goes back down again. And the question, I suppose, is, will that happen this time, and will it happen again? I don't know. As I said before, even if we had long-term projections, we would prefer not to share them, so that if they're wrong, then we can't be vilified in conferences like this. But I think the point is fairly made, that if there is to be even a maintenance of the current level of seaborne supply, then there needs to be a significant amount of investment made in mining equipment. And these are investments which would normally been made in a fairly regular way over recent years, but have not been made either because the prices have been too low, or because the companies have not either had the cash or have not wanted to make the cash available, or have been sufficiently uncertain about the outlook. But for me, and to put a rather more serious gloss on what I said before, it is possible that coal is in a different position now from almost any other commodity, in the sense that perhaps unlike iron ore or copper or some of the other commodities that might normally suffer exactly the same sort of cyclical movements, this time there may be a number of companies which say, this time, actually because we're not quite so sure of the long-term future of coal, that we're going to think not twice but three times before making the investment. And if in particular, it isn't only investment in mining infrastructure, but in new ports and in new rail lines.
Long-term investment.
Yeah, and if it is more difficult to get those permissions, and if there are going to be some investment funds which are going to refuse to put them in, whether it's anything from the World Bank to announcements by companies that they're, or funds or pension funds, that they're not going to invest in these sorts of projects, it doesn't mean to say that they don't happen. We also have to remember, and some of you may know that my background is actually in the oil industry, and sometimes we have to remind ourselves that the players that we're talking about are not necessarily the players that are quoted on the international stock exchanges, but they may be family companies, they may be state-owned companies, or they may be local conglomerates. And different types of investors will have a different perspective about what they want to do and what they want to do with their money. I have no idea, genuinely, what will happen, but I think that it appears that the chance that all of these various companies, which would need to make the investment in mining equipment and ports and infrastructure and all the rest of it, I think given the uncertainties over the outlook for coal, that they're more likely to think longer before actually making those investments.
I mean, I suppose building on that point a little bit, is the restriction to access to capital and new investment, I mean, would you say perhaps that's the primary long-term threat to coal making a sustained comeback?
For me, it's easy to answer these questions because we are doing metallurgical coal, so it has a bit different perspective. So it's easy to invest in these materials. We see demand there. But Howard was talking about thermal coal, I guess. If I would be an investor, I would think twice. I mean, to invest the money with investment of horizon of 15 years, actually.
Harry, it's not my area, but all I'm saying is that if we think about the companies or the entities which would need to make the investment, and there are more obstacles than there used to be. I mean, I have referred regularly, and I think I'll refer again, to all of the famous US West Coast export terminals that Peabody and Arch and everybody else was either going to build or going to support. And I always thought that they were extremely unlikely to see the light of day, mainly because it was hard to see that all the stars would align, that there would be investment in the mines, that there would be investment in the very long rail lines to get from the PRB to Oregon or northern Canada or wherever it was going to be, plus the investment in the port, plus the belief that the customers would be there to buy the coal. And so I thought that when you added up all of those various things, it was highly unlikely that the stars would align that would mean that in the end the investments would be made. But to the extent that there is at least one project which is at least still being discussed or still on the table, the discussion is not over who's going to pay for the 1,000-mile rail line. It is that there are local communities around which are saying, yes, there could be jobs here, but actually we're not sure whether we want that port to be built close to our community. Sometimes I think we in Colombia feel that we're given unnecessary or disproportionate coverage in the press about the realistic concerns about communities around our mine. But it isn't just Colombia. It's the northwest coast of the US. It's India. Not necessarily everybody is very keen on having these various facilities, whether it's a mine or a rail line or a port immediately adjacent to their community. It doesn't mean to say that these things won't happen. It just says that the obstacles to going ahead with those sorts of investments seem to me to be larger than they've ever been before.
Perhaps moving on quickly to take a more global look at things. Obviously, China's been a big driver of prices. It's a place that people always want to know what's going on. I mean, what's your perspective on how the Chinese market is developing in terms of supply?
China is very important, specifically for thermal coal. Now it's a key market, and actually prices of material influenced by Chinese policy. For us, as anthracite producers, is a very big market, so we're supplying more than around 4 million tons per year to Chinese market. And you know, China is quite unpredictable all the time, so we are not 100% sure. We see what they should comply to environmental challenges and regulations at one time. At the same time, they need to support their own coal industry, and they are still keeping the local prices quite high, which give additional demand for local horrific value materials from all around the world. But anyway, the developments, and they will be balanced on these two actions. At one hand, trying to comply with the environment and regulations and issues, and at the same time trying to keep economy on steam, I mean, and growing and continuing this business. For Russian material, we see a good perspective because in the case of limitation of a tonnage, first of all, you know, materials with a local horrific value will disappear from the market, and Russian premium thermal coal, 6,000 calories plus, will be in demand. But at the same time, for my material, for metallurgical coals, we still have huge demand there because all the environmental regulations now affecting Chinese metallurgical industry, they are going out from the blast furnace to more efficient and to more ecologically friendly technologies, like sintering, like electric ovens and all that stuff. So at certain period of time, I see a very good demand for the next year, definitely from China. I don't see any kind of bad surprises. Of course, price correction is possible. We know what there is a Chinese New Year, and when the buyer is going out from the market, it immediately affects the prices. We can see these trends all around the year. But generally, we see a very good demand, and this is fundamental demand in Chinese economy, and all the ecological regulations which will be implied, and the emphasis to support the local mining industry, which, I mean, very crucial for this economy still, as the biggest producer of a coal, will affect positively on the coal pricing anyway.
I would simply say, 我不知道. That is, I have no idea. I lived in China for 5 years. And when I came back to Europe in 15 years ago, I was intrigued to go to my first ever coal conference, which was the one that was still at that time called the Carbon Club. And somebody was presenting a global supply-demand balance. But he decided to do it excluding China because we don't know what's going to happen in China, so let's look at all of the other countries. And that seemed to me to be rather strange, given the potential importance of China in the global supply-demand balance. At that stage, you may remember, China was a net exporter of coal, and there was an expectation that it would move to imports, but nobody really knew. So after 5 years living in China, I would simply conclude that I only understand a little bit about the way that the country works. But one understanding that I think I came away with, and this is not a brilliant insight by me, it is that the overriding objective of the Chinese authorities, and that means the party rather than the government, is the right combination of social stability and economic growth, with the understanding that the one will help support the other. And certainly whilst I was there, and I think this has broadly continued, there was this sort of understanding, this tacit understanding between the government and the people, that we will give you robust economic growth, which will give better prospects for your children than it did for you. We will try to guarantee social stability, but the quid pro quo is that the broad social and political structure won't change. And I think you can still see large elements of that. We tend to see, whether it's from the policy forums that have been taking place in the last couple of weeks, or the more sporadic announcements that you get through the year, you get a reaction to a certain phenomenon that's happening. So, to give a big example from 15 years ago and a smaller example now, 15 years ago, just as I was leaving Shanghai, the real concern of the government was that all of the prosperity had come to the coastal regions, that you could look from Tianjin to Beijing to Shanghai to Guangzhou, and all of these were the regions that had seen enormous growth, and that wasn't feeding very far west, and it certainly wasn't getting to the very far west. And so the overriding policy of the Chinese government from that point onwards, and I can't remember the exact name of the policy, but it was something like Go West. And it was to ensure that the prosperity was sufficiently shared. And it was that started to change all sorts of policies, whether it was the development of coal mines, or whether it was the development of large-scale, long-distance electricity transmission. But that was the driver at the time. 2 years ago or 18 months ago, the real concern was the pollution in Beijing. And so, the Chinese government then studies these things and then suddenly then comes out with an enormous policy which is designed to address what they regard as the immediate concern of the time. And you can see that across the board. And so if the Chinese then decide that renewables are a good thing, not only because they can reduce pollution at home, but because then it will allow the country to build up an enormous expertise and manufacturing capability in, for example, solar panels, then a combination of circumstances then will lead the Chinese government to go for a policy announcement. And I cannot tell you, I would love to be able to say, I have a good idea where that will lead us in the future. And you also have to remember, I think, that just as within any government, there are competing ideas, and that there are people who are pro-nuclear, there are people who are pro-coal, there are people who are pro-renewables. We don't tend to see the debate out in the open as we would in Europe, but it's certainly happening. One of the differences, though, is that once the government has decided, then although implementation isn't necessarily immediate and necessarily 100%, it does tend to happen. And I have no idea which way this country will go. That's a very long way around of saying Wabuzadal.
Okay, so we've got a few minutes now to take a couple of questions. So if anyone in the audience wants to ask one with a mic, please raise your hand. We also have a few down here on Slido. So the top voted question, is Poland the only major player in the European coal industry? I mean, what's your take on Poland?
Poland is I personally don't believe what coal industries will survive in Europe at all. Okay, Poland still producing, still supplying, but now Poland became a huge importer of Russian thermal coal in season time, and generally become a good market for the Russian import, honestly. But I think what coal will remain in emergency markets, definitely. But as we see, as previous speaker showed us a clear picture for the UK market, steadily it will lose tonnage, it will lose the capacity, production capacity in Europe, definitely. It's my personal point of view.
I don't know, it would seem to be probably a gradual change. It was very interesting to go to, I think, the most recent Coaltrans Poland, which was 2 years ago. I think there was the one 2 years ago where the keynote speech was given by a minister from the government. And it's the first time for some time that I have heard a government minister speak strongly in favor of coal. And what we heard from Carlos and Trevor early this morning is that not only because Poland has a significant coal industry, but also a significant amount of thermal coal use, that it isn't necessarily aligned with the majority of the other countries in the EU. I would assume that, but I have no particular crystal ball, that it will slowly, but probably much more slowly than others would perhaps like, move gradually into alignment. But it is going to be a slow process.
Thanks. Just for anyone interested in Poland, I just thought I would mention that we will be running Coaltrans Poland again next year. So if you want to know anything, please do make sure you join us for that. Is there a question over there?
A question for Andrey. You were saying that the problem with exports for yourselves and for other Russians is a shortage of rail wagons. Is that really the case, or is it that there are too many rail wagons and they're not in the right place and that they're clogging up the system?
If you're talking about specifically about car wagons, actually I was telling what there are several reasons actually why we cannot export more. And deficit of car wagons, it's a new problem which appeared. You know what? There was a policy to support, if you're specifically talking about this issue currently, there was a policy to get rid of old car wagons to support in a crisis time, to support the production of a new car wagons. So around 200,000 car wagons was taken out, so become a scrap actually. And the same period of time, 58,000 tons car wagons, if I remember correctly, was newly produced. So there is a kind of deficit. But you know, it's all the time changing situations. Sometimes there is a consolidations. Then everything is put into the major company as an operator. Now there is a new demand. Let's make reserve of the car wagon. So this issue is happening all the time, actually. But the main issue for now for Russian exporters, not even car wagons, it's temporary things. The same as like natural disaster which come in Australia. It's just affecting sometimes. But the main issue is a deficit of ports, export ports. Okay, we have to pay more for car wagons now. We are ready to do this because market is letting us to pay this. But I don't have possibility to export more from the existing port activities. There is a huge investments, but still they are postponing. You know, Carbo One still has not opened the new terminal. So new terminals, I mean, money is investing in it because we still believe in coal export. We still believe in a coal demand. And the coal industry is a core, one of the core industry of Russia, actually. So this investment would be done. But for last 2 years, new capacity is not here still. Still, there is a, in 2018, 2019, 2020, this capacity will appear, so we can use it. Arithmetically, we've done between 2015 and 2016, there was 5% growth of Russian export. This year, we will see maybe 10%. But if we would see enough capacity for the export, we could potentially add a little bit more. But for now, it's not possible technically, because I will have to pay more for the car wagons, I will have to pay more for ports. In case I'm not ready to do this, somebody else will take my place. Very simple as it. You can talk with all the Russian producers, they are all in the same basket currently.
Okay, thanks, Andrey. So unfortunately, that's about all we have time for. We have to break for lunch now, which, just so everyone's aware, the lunchroom, if you go left and walk right down to the end of the hall. If some of you are staying in the hotel, it's the same area as the breakfast place. So we'll be returning at 2 p.m., but first of all, I'd like to raise a hand of applause for our two speakers, Andrey and Howard. Thank you.